discuss long-term impacts, and to hear from a diverse panel of stakeholders about current reform efforts at the state and federal level. Since 1991, FAMM has been a consistent voice and a fierce advocate for sentencing reform in state capitals across the country, as well as throughout the halls of Congress, amplifying your stories and working diligently to ensure that justice is preserved and that families are made whole. Mandatory minimums are laws set by Congress and by state lawmakers. These laws require judges to impose automatic minimum prison terms for certain offenses. They remove a judge's ability to consider the individual person being sentenced, the specifics of their situation, and any other mitigating factors. Mandatory minimums lead to sentences that are unjust, irrational, and counterproductive. And there's at least 30 years worth of evidence showing that these harsh sentences do not make our communities safer. Mandatory minimums result in unjust sentences that do not fit the crime, and they create unwarranted racial discrepancies and disparities in our prisons at the taxpayer's expense. These are but a few of the reasons as to why FAMM's opposition to mandatory minimums remains unwavering. Today's panel will provide us with more insight into mandatory minimums and tell us about their work in sentencing reform. We're pleased to have with us today former federal judge Kevin Sharp, senior policy specialist for the Crime and Justice Institute, Vanessa Thompson, FAMM member and reform advocate Sagan Soto-Stanton, and FAMM's State Legislative Affairs Manager, Mr. Matthew Charles. Thank you all so much for joining us today. Before we get started, I'd like for the panelists, starting with Judge Sharp, to take a couple of minutes to introduce yourselves and tell your perspectives on mandatory minimums.
Well, thank you, Kevin. I appreciate being invited to this event today. It's an incredibly important topic that a lot of people outside of the system don't know exists. So I came on the bench as an appointee by President Obama, having been a civil practitioner. I think I'd maybe worked one criminal case coming out of law school. So mostly done a civil rights background and really hadn't run into mandatory minimums because I hadn't worked a lot in the criminal realm until I took the bench, and was really very surprised that for all of the work it took to get on the bench, that the most important thing that I would do as a judge was taken away from me and mandated as mandatory sentencing. So for those who don't know, to make it to the federal bench is a kind of a gauntlet. So first you've got to be selected by the White House to even be considered. So you get vetted by the White House, you're vetted by the attorneys inside the White House, your files are sent over to the Department of Justice, where you are vetted again and investigated by DOJ and by the FBI. They'll run full background checks. I will tell on myself that as part of that background check, I found, or the FBI found, that I had a $50 unpaid activity fee from when I was in college. So it was a very thorough background check, and I went back and paid my $50 fee that I had missed, years before. And then your file is sent over to the Senate Judiciary Committee, where they have their own FBI agents and investigators. You're investigated again. Then your file is sent to the American Bar Association, where they'll run surveys among the members of the bar, all to decide whether or not you have the intellect, the temperament, and the judgment to sit and make decisions in these most important of cases, right? So the civil side is by and large about money, but the criminal side of what you do as a district court judge is about liberty. And it really is the most important thing a judge is going to do. And it's why it takes so much to give someone that lifetime appointment. And then once you're out of the Senate Judiciary Committee, you still have to be voted on by the entire Senate, all for those three reasons. And then I get to the bench, having gone through that gauntlet, and see that they really don't want you to do that. What they really want to do is show you how tough they are on crime. And Congress mandates certain sentences. And you may recall, you may or may not know this, that a lot of this, although it was back in the 20s during Prohibition, there were mandatory minimums, but mostly it's a result of the war on drugs and the attempt by Congress to show how tough we can be on drug crimes. And so in the 1980s, you started with some of the crack versus cocaine disparities, but then by the 90s, you really saw these 3 strikes laws. And that's where, as Kevin mentioned earlier, the judge who's supposed to be making these judgments and deciding what's the appropriate sentence, what kind of sentence is sufficient, but not more harsh than necessary to comply with the reasons that we sentence someone, all of that's taken away, and Congress tells you what we're going to do is give someone life for these sentences. And that was my first introduction to that world, and really bothered me so much in such a way that, and we can talk about this later, that ultimately I decided to give up my lifetime appointment to the federal bench and come and talk about these issues and really fight against what is such an unfair set of circumstances that leads to these overly harsh sentences, creating liabilities for people who really could be assets. So thanks. I think I may have taken up too much of my time, but that was my introduction to that world.
Thank you, Judge Sharp. Sagan?
Yes. Hello, everyone. My name is Sagan Soto-Stanton. My husband was originally sentenced in 2011 for a nonviolent drug-related charge. From a family perspective, it's definitely been a challenge. Him receiving life sentence at the time, I believe our youngest was 1 and our oldest was 8. That instantly made me a single parent. I really had to start thinking about the future and how I'm able to provide for my children. So it's definitely been a challenge. I will say that I'm definitely grateful for the partnerships with FAMM and other nonprofit organizations that have showed me the ropes, educated me on being an advocate wife for my husband, and as well as showing me how powerful and how impactful my story would be for not only single mothers, but single parents, across the United States. So I'm definitely happy to be here today and happy to talk more about the impact of mandatory minimums.
Thank you. Vanessa?
Oh man, I'm about to talk so much longer than you both. Get ready, sorry. So my name is Vanessa Thompson. I'm a senior policy specialist at the Crime Justice Institute. And prior to my role here, I served just shy of a decade in the Florida Senate. I didn't know what a mandatory minimum was until 2015 when my boss served on the Criminal Justice Committee in the Senate. Most people think of our office as just the Criminal Justice Office, but both of us spent that summer digging so deep into Florida's practices and then looking at other states to see what they did differently and what we could potentially do in Florida. I spent majority of that interim reaching out to legislative staffers in states like South Dakota and South Carolina, just cold calling them to see what I could find out about legislation that they had passed. And then we reached out to the experts, the national experts, and connected with not only the organization that I'm at now, but Pew and FAMM, amongst others, to learn just about what was wrong, what was going on in Florida, why we had these mandatory minimum sentences, and what we could do, where we could go from there. And then we started to tour prisons, because if we were going to talk the talk, we were going to walk the walk. We were really going to understand the issues. So fast forward to the Federal First Step Act, and Florida was on fire. I mean, we were absolutely pumped. We were looking at this like, we finally have the ultimate example of what we knew to be true, that this wasn't a partisan issue. This was a very bipartisan issue. So during the 2019 legislative session, which is when I was lucky enough to meet Mr. Matthew Charles, my boss and former representative and now Congressman Byron Donalds filed the Florida First Step Act. And we weren't setting out to abolish all mandatory minimums we were just setting out to bring some kind of common sense to this system. It's a system that still today operates under the rule that if the lowest permissible sentence for an individual is less than the mandatory minimum, then they're going to get the mandatory minimum. So this Senate bill and this House bill had a ton of bipartisan support. In addition to the sponsors, the Senate bill had 6 other co-sponsors, which were 3 Republicans and 3 Democrats. And in the House, we had, 3 Democrats and another Republican. And the bill passed unanimously out of its first 2 committees in the Senate. And it got to the full Appropriations Committee, which, as we all know, politics, people from all different backgrounds serve in government. So when you get to a high level committee like that, it's people that have varying levels of understanding of the legislation. And it managed to pass out of that 17-2. It was amazing. We felt great about it. But the House ended up gutting the bill in the end. And that was a really devastating blow to us because we thought that this was rational, bipartisan, conservative driven, and we were going to posture the state to enhance public safety and be better stewards of taxpayer dollars. But 2019 wasn't the first time that we had introduced bills like this, and it wasn't the last time. So we became the office that a lot of incarcerated individuals' loved ones would reach out to, whether it was for help for their loved one who was incarcerated or just to advocate for change. And the calls came from not only all over the state, but all over the country. And then we started to get more and more letters from individuals who were incarcerated. And they were sharing their struggles, their triumphs while they were incarcerated, why they were there, what they were missing on the outside. And I wish that I still had those letters because they were so meaningful. They would even tell us that they would turn on the committee hearings. And so it felt like we were bringing some kind of hope to people. And it's hard not to feel like in the end, we let a lot of people down. I cried every year that our legislation didn't pass, but 2019 was definitely the hardest. But I learned so many important things during that time. And most importantly, about the people that we were fighting for. These are moms, dads, sisters and brothers, sons and daughters, and they just want to go home. These are people that maybe they weren't on the right path, but they never had the help that they needed to get on the right path in the first place. And that's why I'm here, for those people. So
Thank you.
I'm so excited to be here. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, and thank you for your work. Matthew?
My name is Matthew Charles. I'm FAMM State Legislative Affairs Manager. I'm also a formerly incarcerated individual. Since I've been working with FAMM, it's been a great thing, especially to be able to work with an organization that actually was founded on the principle that we oppose mandatory minimums in all forms and fashion, because as Kevin stated a little bit earlier, it doesn't utilize any aggravating or mitigating factors. It actually gives, like Judge Kevin Sharp has stated, no judicial discretion for when he was on the bench to give somebody a sentence that rightly fit them. So I've been grateful and thankful to be able to go around opposing mandatory minimums in different states, being able to see laws change in regards to getting rid of some mandatory minimums or just changing a law that overrides those mandatory minimums. And I just look forward to this conversation.
Thank you, Matthew. I want to go back to Judge Sharp. You touched on this briefly in your intro, but could you give us some more information about how mandatory minimum sentencing laws came into effect and the problems that they were originally meant to solve?
Yeah, a lot of these came about, at least as we know them today, through the 3 strikes laws that were part of the war on drugs, the get tough on crime era of the 80s and 90s. But they really didn't take into account what they were trying to accomplish, except by showing that we're tough on crime. But, did that make sense? And Ultimately, what we can all see now is it did not, because sentencing should be individualized, right? I can't sentence someone to a sufficient punishment if I cannot take into account all of the things that brought us all here together in that courtroom on that day, right? What was the educational background? What's the criminal history? What's the family background? What message are we sending to others? What message are we sending to this individual? All of that has to get analyzed as part of this decision-making process. And I think the best example of that, and the one that ultimately kind of struck me to the core and made me start to think about whether it's time to leave the bench or not, was early on, after I was confirmed, I was randomly assigned a drug conspiracy case. 32, 33 different defendants, all at different levels, right? You had, just like any conspiracy, there's the leader, and it kind of flows down through the organization. In a conspiracy, the defendants do not have to know each other. They don't have to know that they were part of a conspiracy. They don't have to know what their role was. And so it's easy to see the different levels of participation and culpability. There's no question in my mind that the events, as the U.S. Attorney's Office had laid them out, were happening and had happened. But there were some individuals who were really so tangential to the larger conspiracy that in one case it was really happenstance that someone was even caught up in this. And the young man that I'm thinking of is a young man at that time named Chris Young. And I'm not sure that Chris would have even been arrested, except that he was in the place when the FBI and DEA decided to take down the ringleader. They happened to be at the same gas station and were talking. They weren't meeting there. They just happened to be getting gas at the same gas station. Everybody was taken down simultaneously. And Chris gets caught up in this. He had done some things to further the drug transactions, but such a minor player. And in fact, as part of the tapes, there were tape recordings going on. He wasn't the target of that, but he was on one of the phone calls with the ringleader. He didn't know how to make the crack. And the ringleader was frustrated with him through this telephone call because Chris was so inept at what he had been asked to do that ultimately the leader of the conspiracy said, just forget it, give it back to me, I'll do it myself. But Chris gets caught up in this, and he's arrested along with two other people who were fringe participants in all of this. Chris is 21 years old. The U.S. attorney makes an offer. He can plead guilty, and he'll get 14 years. Now, Chris is 21, and he knows he's been a minor player in all of this, but to a 21-year-old, 14 years is a long time. And to him, he didn't appreciate how long that was going to actually be. And he ends up getting a different lawyer, another public defender, who convinces him he probably should take that deal. Although having sentenced everyone who was part of that conspiracy, it still would have been one of the longer sentences. The average sentence for folks as part of that, even those who are more culpable, was 12 years. So he rejects it. His new lawyer convinces him, let's go back to the U.S. attorney and talk about, resolving this and you pleading guilty. But the U.S. attorney is now mad and says that 14 years is not there anymore. Now it's 20. And Chris says, I'll take my chances at trial. 20 years to a 21-year-old is life. And in Chris's mind, you're offering me life to plead guilty. Why don't I take my chances? Not realizing that life is life. And ultimately, he was convicted. And he's got 2 strikes. This is going to be his 3rd strike. He's had 2 prior felonies. Now, they were both drug charges, but the amount of drugs, the weight of drugs combined for the first 2 offenses was the weight of a quarter, the coin. These were not serious drug charges or activity, although they were federal felonies. But those are strikes 1 and 2, both that happened when he was 18 and 19 years old. And now at 21, he's picked up again. He's convicted in a jury trial, and I've got to give him a mandatory life sentence. Had I been able to use the factors in the way that sentencing was envisioned, I mean, maybe this is a 5-year sentence, maybe, but I didn't have that opportunity. And instead, I'm going to sentence, at that time, then 23-year-old young man to life in prison. He is now going to die for this role, minor role, in a drug conspiracy where even the major players weren't getting that kind of time. And so, for those who aren't familiar with this, at a criminal sentencing, the defendant gets the opportunity to allocute, to talk to the court before sentencing. Sometimes those statements to the court are short. Someone may stand up and apologize for what they've done, apologize to their family. Some may stand up and still, advocate for their innocence. But that's not what Chris did. Chris had taken the time that he had been in prison, awaiting trial and awaiting his sentencing, to educate himself. And he got up there, and for 45 minutes to an hour, he spoke to me about Greek philosophy, about international monetary policy, about banking, about African-American history, about science, about books, the books that he had been reading, and all of the things that he would do and could do if he wasn't going to die in prison. And this was incredibly hard to listen to. And I then engaged him, which I didn't always do with defendants at a sentencing. I would always listen and sometimes incorporate things that they said, but I wouldn't necessarily engage someone in the conversation that they're having. But I did that with Chris. Part of it was to delay having to sentence this young man to life in prison. I could delay this process. It was still going to happen. But then we started talking about books, and he talked about rap music and books that I thought he should read. He was giving me books that he thought I would like, and we engaged in this conversation. But eventually, that had to end, and I had to sentence him to life in prison. But I'm thinking the entire time, one, and I know Sagan really experiences this, the defendant is not the only one who is sentenced. There's a ripple effect. The family is sentenced along with that, incarceration of the individual, and the spouses and children and parents and friends, everybody is punished. And the same was true of Chris. Chris's mother was in the courtroom. His brother had committed suicide. And I just kept thinking, what a waste. This young man is so smart and has so much to offer, not just to his small community in Clarksville, Tennessee, but to a much larger community. And we're going to have him die in prison and pay to have him die in prison, turn him into a liability and kill him, rather than have him the asset that he is and that he could be. And I ultimately sentenced Chris to life in prison, but really that started the process of me thinking, is this where I should be? Am I more useful to society having to sentence the Chris Youngs of the world and complaining about it, but not doing anything about it? Or am I more useful stepping down from the bench and using my voice as a former federal judge, as someone who's so involved in this process, that I have something to say that hopefully legislators will listen to? And I ultimately came to the conclusion that I was going to step down after only 6 years on the bench and started representing Chris Young, and ended up at the White House talking about Chris Young, talking about Matthew Charles with President Trump, and working on clemency for Chris. And the president signed clemency papers, and Chris was released on President Trump's last day in office during his first term. And Chris is out. We still stay in close contact with each other, and is actually a student at SMU and doing great, becoming that asset, and is that asset that I knew he could be. But how many other Chris Youngs have we lost? And will we continue to lose if we don't change this system, if we don't sentence people with sentences that are not so harsh, that serve a purpose rather than just locking someone up and then telling people how tough we are, see how tough we are, but destroying lives and destroying communities in the process. That was my introduction to mandatory minimums, and it's become a life-changing event for me.
Wow. Thank you, Judge Sharp. Yeah, unfortunately, there are too many Chris Youngs out there, and a lot of them won't get the opportunity that he has had to make it to the other side and rebuild his life from mistakes made at a very young age. As you mentioned, when someone is incarcerated, the family does the time with them. And a lot of communities are impacted. A lot of communities are made worse when a pivotal member of the family is incarcerated. Sagan, I know you've dealt with this personally, and if you can share with us some more information about how your family has dealt with the past few years and just the community that you have around you.
Absolutely. I definitely want to just say kudos to you, Judge Sharp. I'm literally trying to fight back tears from hearing, your perspective and experience from being a judge and having compassion and empathy for people like Chris Young. So sorry. It's always, I've never heard a judge's perspective as far as the impact of mandatory minimums. So it's definitely moving to me as well. Mandatory minimums personally impacted my family. And excuse me, let me get a sip of water. Excuse me. Mandatory minimums impacted my family. I think a word to describe it is traumatizing. My husband's been gone for 12 and a half years. And I think it probably took me maybe 7 or 8 to even have the conversation with my oldest. I didn't tell my baby, who's now 13, until maybe a year or 2 ago. And at that time, my husband's time was reduced significantly. I think the mandatory minimums, as Judge Sharp mentioned, I feel like it targets disproportionately affected communities like myself. It impacts the Black and brown families. And I also think that it's unfortunate that these laws remove the judicial discretion, leading to many families receiving mandatory minimums, especially harsh sentencing for nonviolent charges. I feel like families are torn apart. I feel like children are raised in single parent families and homes. And I also feel like, knowing who my husband is today and the potential that he definitely would have been a positive impact on our community in our hometown, which is Hinesville, Georgia. I feel that, with my husband receiving clemency for former President Biden's last day in the office, I know that my husband's going to come home, hopefully the next few months, and be a positive impact for our community. He's really focusing on plans as far as things that he can do differently in his community. So I'm excited about that piece, but I will say it has definitely been a very challenging 12 and a half years without having him here to support our kids. So it's a huge impact for the family. So thank you.
Yeah, no. Thank you, and congratulations. And we at FAMM definitely wish you and your family the best of luck in this next chapter. And remember, we're FAMM, we're family, so we're here to support you even as you move into this next chapter. What role do you think personal stories like yours play when speaking to legislators about mandatory minimums?
Well, first and foremost, I have to give kudos to FAMM because FAMM, again, as I mentioned earlier, was the one that kind of showed me the ropes. I feel that personal stories play a positive impact because it makes the issues more relatable to the lawmakers and to the public. Statistics and legal arguments can be compelling, but firsthand acts of suffering and injustice creates that emotional connection, often leading to policy changes. So my story, our stories, can help illustrate flaws in this legal system.
Thank you. And that's the work we try to accomplish here at FAMM, and always trying to amplify the stories of our members across the country who are dealing with this every day and who have stories and who have voices that deserve to be heard. And that brings me to Vanessa, who does this work in state capitals. She's been in Florida, she's been to the Dakotas, and I would love if you could tell us a little bit more about that and just some of the barriers that you've personally faced in repealing mandatory minimums at the state level.
Yeah, and so, what was just mentioned is those nonviolent offenses. And I think the general public and legislators alike typically equate mandatory minimum sentences with sending someone away for a long time for very serious conduct, murder, kidnapping, etc. So there's an uncomfortability with lawmakers to move on that. There's like a mental disconnect almost between the fact that there are so many nonviolent offenses or offenses that don't actually have victims that are also swept up into mandatory minimum policies. So in a lot of places where there have been reforms, it's because the community and lawmakers come together and they say, these sentences don't make sense for these types of offenses when it is nonviolent, when there is no victim. So you see a lot of drug offenses change first. Another barrier is often raised with kind of that certainty in sentencing. People want to see someone finish a term of their sentence. But that also comes from a place of, I think, a lack of understanding on how this all works. Aside from that, I really have to say, I think the two biggest barriers are the different levels of understanding and the national narrative, what we're seeing on the news every day. So as an example, I spent last weekend with my mom in Illinois, and I grew up outside of Chicago. So the news is a lot about crime. It's a lot about violent crime, and that gets the clicks, right? That gets the attention. But there's never a follow-up to say, well, last time this year, there were X amount more, violent and deadly homicides in the city. You don't really get that anywhere across the country. We're not seeing the other side of the coin. We're only getting the negative story. So those lawmakers are trying to be responsive to their constituencies who typically criminal justice is not up here in anybody's mind. People are worried about the cost of living, their taxes, insurance, education. They don't know a lot about the criminal justice system, and it's not something that's sexy or popular to campaign on. So people aren't really talking about it. Those who are seeking office aren't sinking their teeth into this issue. It's something that's often reacted to. So when we're working with lawmakers with varying degrees of knowledge, because they have different backgrounds, and we can't expect everyone to be an expert in every single subject, especially if a member is not part of a committee, there's a different hurdle that we have to overcome there. They may understand what's happening on the news. They may hear things from their local law enforcement, from their DA and PD, but they don't understand the nitty-gritty about the trends in their state, what the data says. So mandatory minimums may sound like they're going to eradicate crime, and it's pretty easy to go with that narrative because it's such a complex issue.
Totally agree. As you mentioned, the political aspect of it, how criminal justice is politicized and demonized in a lot of ways, really makes it tough for lawmakers and advocates to get work done. What advice would you give to a lot of the advocates who are watching from home about how to address their lawmakers. Just from a personal level, they're not polished advocates, they're not lobbyists, they're just impacted loved ones. What advice would you give them on how to navigate these political dynamics?
So I'm going to say something that I hope isn't disheartening at all, but it definitely is kind of unpopular. This stuff takes a lot of time and persistence because they are such complicated issues, because there are so many stakeholders involved. It's very different to coalesce everyone in a Capitol building around one idea, regardless of what policy you're talking about, but criminal justice especially. And so it's really hard to go in and try to copy and paste legislation from other places that may or may not work in your state. So for those who are, the individual advocate, learning from an organization like FAMM, becoming more involved in the political process in general, trying to understand more about what the structure of your state looks like, and leaning on other organizations to get data, to get the research, and to have your talking points are all really important when you're going to sit down with members.
Thank you. Yeah, no, we didn't get here overnight, and we won't fix it overnight. And in terms of, I know there's always been a debate between repeal and reform. And if you can just tell us, in your opinion, what are some sentencing models that you think would be a good replacement for the current mandatory minimums that we're seeing?
So it depends. It depends on what the goals are, of the state. If it's really, you're unhappy with judicial discretion, you can impose a sentencing grid that brings some kind of fairness to the system. But we know that that's not the ideal system to put in place, right? Because you still have the inability at that point to take into considerations the factors that brought this individual to the courtroom to begin with. So if we're trying to make a positive, lasting change for people and their communities and public safety, research has found that sentencing models that have a tiered approach to escalating behavior, we want to have an appropriate punishment for the crime, that those are much better because they are tailored appropriately to what's going on and for the individual.
Thank you. And you mentioned your time in the Florida legislature. Going across the country, what are some lessons that you have from your experience in Florida that you would encourage other states to implement or learn from?
Well, for states that still have them, keep going. For the advocates, keep going. I think that it's important, and we've got a good model, right? We've got the First Step Act. There are reports that come out every year now and moving forward. So we can see, the 2022 report, I think the recidivism rate, let me just make sure I have it right, was 15.9%. 2023 report, recidivism rate is 12.4%, right? So there are positive outcomes from this type of reform, and having that information with you, again, is very, very critically important. But there are states across the country that have reformed either all or part of their mandatory minimums. Everyone knows that New York got rid of their mandatory minimums. They didn't see a rise in crime. Maryland, same thing. They didn't see a rise in crime. Places like Nevada, Ohio, Oklahoma, very specific offenses have been, mandatory minimums have been removed, and we see positive outcomes. It's all about what you're doing in the front end and how you're investing. And that's a really important piece of the conversation to have with lawmakers, as well as, well, we don't want to be reactive. We don't want to get to the point where somebody has to be sentenced. What do we have to do before they get there? And I think that that's a really important perspective to bring to your lawmakers as well.
Thank you. And I want to stay on state advocacy for a minute and move over to Mr. Matthew Charles, who is FAMM's State Legislative Affairs Manager. doing a lot of great work out of Nashville. Matthew, if you could tell us some of the key legislative reforms that you're seeing at the state level that address mandatory minimums.
Well, I'll share one in it exactly. When we was able to actually see the drug-free school zone law reformed here in Tennessee, that was a mandatory minimum where a person who actually committed that offense will receive an enhanced sentence. And that sentence locked them into sometimes triple or quadruple the amount of time that they could receive. But in showing how sometimes a sentence where it is fixed on the amount of times you have to serve is not necessarily deserving of the individual that committed the crime, because oftentimes the sentence is much greater than the severity of the offense committed. And when it came to the drug-free school zone law, there were people who committed that offense because they were in a school zone. They received an enhancement, but had they been not in the school zone, they would not have received that enhancement. But an example of that is the fact that some of these people were caught at midnight or at 2 or 3 in the morning when the schools were closed and no children were around, no vulnerable people were around. So that was a law that needed to be changed, because even though they created it thinking that it would cause people to not commit those crimes in an area where children are. Another thing, when it comes to drug-free school zones are in Nashville, Tennessee, where I'm at, are almost in every neighborhood, because there's always a church, there's always a daycare, there's always a school, there's always a park somewhere around in that vicinity. And that's a good thing that you have those places in that vicinity for the residents of that community. But whenever you start giving people enhanced sentences or saying that you face a mandatory minimum sentence of such and such amount because you committed your offense in there, but not really looking at, as we expressed a little bit earlier, any mitigating factors, any aggravating factors, any defense that you can raise, saying, hey, it was midnight when I committed this offense, the schools were closed, or it was the weekend. So that's one example. But another example is, as I expressed earlier, FAMM was founded in opposition to mandatory minimums, even though now we address all type of prison reform and sentencing reform. But the fact that our founder's brother was actually sentenced to a mandatory minimum sentence, where this was his first offense, but yet you were giving him a sentence that equaled the amount of time that you would give to somebody that had been breaking the law for years and years, or it was not their first offense. So we've been able to see some changes made here. And you were just talking about here in Tennessee, you're talking about overall in the work that we do, Kevin.
Overall, but particularly in Tennessee, because, well, that's where you're based, and the South definitely has a history of harsher sentencing laws than the rest of the country. So it's always good to see that work is being done, particularly down there, and to change these circumstances. And we've heard from Judge Sharp about Chris's story, but Matthew, I was wondering if you could share a little bit more about the real world impact of mandatory minimums and what they've had on you and your family and families that you work with.
Okay, definitely so. Whenever we're talking about a mandatory minimum, we're talking about a sentence to where the person is actually sentenced to regardless of why they're being sentenced or the factors concerning that sentence. And in my own situation, I was sentenced under the mandatory minimum guidelines. I received a federal offense, and at the time, the sentencing guidelines were mandatory. That means that I was placed at a sentencing range, a base offense level in a sentencing range, and I had to be sentenced according to that range. And my guidelines being mandatory, I had to be sentenced according to that. But the law changed in United States versus Booker and made the sentencing guidelines non-mandatory. They had to be reviewed, but they weren't mandatory to where you had to abide by them. So when I was actually sentenced, I was sentenced to a 35-year sentence. I was sentenced at base offense level 36. And because of my sentence length, I was locked into that sentence. But when it comes to the work that I do in other states, we know, just like Vanessa has stated, I'm certain just like Kevin Sharp has stated, oftentimes the mindset of the legislators is that if you give a person a mandatory minimum sentence, it will cause other offenders to not commit that offense or that crime. But it doesn't work that way. A mandatory minimum does not stop another offender from committing that crime. As a matter of fact, it costs more money to sentence somebody under the mandatory minimum scheme than it's actually worth. And then you eliminate the rehabilitation of that individual or his, demeanor or attitude, even when he goes into prison to start serving that sentence. So by me being in a federal prison, I was able to see people sentenced to all type of different mandatory minimums. As Judge Sharp, Kevin Sharp can attest to, the federal sentencing guidelines has all type of mandatory minimums or sentences that are appropriate for whatever offense that an individual commits. But I was able to, I'm real glad to see that the sentencing guidelines after the fact will change from mandatory to advisory, and now they are to be consulted and not just, demand that you sentence a person to that sentence.
Thank you. And just from your personal research in this capacity working with FAMM, can you touch on some of the racial and economic disparities that you've seen as a result of these sentencing practices?
Yes, Vanessa actually spoke about it a little bit earlier as well. Oftentimes we see some of the worst crimes. The first thing that jumps in the legislator's mind is to create a mandatory minimum for this crime that will stop it from happening. We also see now that a lot of less crimes, a crime is a crime, but I'm just talking about lesser in offense or nature, meaning not just violent crimes, but they have actually started giving mandatory minimum sentences for. And the sad part is that unless we speak with legislators and other advocates, letting them know that this mindset of giving more time has shown to be ineffective in creating or bringing out with the result that you would like. And due to the fact that a lot of times legislators don't fully understand that or never heard that, or they just choose to disregard that, they come out with mandatory minimum sentences. We've seen them in many states that we work in, meaning FAMM and my colleagues. And oftentimes we go and we testify at those hearings and we bring the specific data. We show them the cost of what this mandatory minimum would cost the state. We show them what other states to have mandatory minimum in effect say about them. But a lot of times that falls on deaf ears because the logic is, and it actually probably sounds logical to those that are listening to me at this time. If you give somebody a harsh or determinate sentence and expect that person to serve that sentence, then that crime should be less committed. But all it actually does, as I stated a little bit earlier, is cost the state more money. It overcrowds prisons and it hinders the rehabilitation efforts of the individual that just got sentenced, who is going to be returning to the community, as well as may cause him to go in and disrupt the rehabilitative programs that are taking place in the prison because he's frustrated that he's sentenced up under a mandatory minimum and he's not going anywhere regardless of his good behavior, regardless of what programming or vocational trades that he may earn. So all of those things work negatively against a mandatory minimum sentence.
As we see, and thank you for those comments, as we see the work continue and how we make so much progress and then we take a few steps backwards. And this is a question for the rest of the panel, and a lot of you have touched on this in your stories, but just wanted to ask directly, if you were to meet a lawmaker who was interested in proposing new mandatory minimum sentencing, because we still see it at the federal level and at the state level, what would you say that you think would convince them? Because I know a lot of times we have facts and we have stories and statistics about why this isn't working, and if they fall on deaf ears. Matthew and Vanessa, particularly in the work that you do in the state capitals, and I'll start with Matthew, what's something that a layperson can tell a lawmaker as to why it would be a bad idea to implement a new mandatory minimum sentencing practice?
I would say I can't tell him it's just flawed logic that he's believing, but I will tell him that the data shows and disproves otherwise what mandatory minimums do. They're actually very costly to the state and they have little to no effect. I'm not going to say they'll have absolutely no effect, so I'm going to say little to none effect. And the fact that oftentimes the reason of creating this mandatory minimum is because a new epidemic has came on the scene. Back when I was sentenced, there was crack cocaine was the main drug that was sold in the neighborhoods of color, the areas that were actually targeted most of the time for mandatory sentences. So that disproportionately affected people of color and poor people. So whenever I speak with legislators, I let them know that the result of this law, if it passes, is going to affect this group of people, this population of people, but also showing them the data to where it doesn't work and how costly it is, and explain to them that we believe in individualized fair sentencing. That's one thing that we promote here at FAMM, is that we believe that an individual should be held accountable for the crime that they committed based on the capacity or the level of their involvement in the crime. And if everybody that goes before the judge, which Judge Kevin Sharp, my friend Kevin Sharp, said a little bit earlier, for those that don't know, since we're on this, Judge Kevin Sharp at the time was the one who released me in 2016. I was able to come home for a small period, close to 2 years, because the prosecutor appealed my sentence and the Court of Appeals ruled in their favor, and I had to be resentenced and sent back to federal prison. But Kevin Sharp was the judge that released me then. But as he had already—
It was the right thing to do then. It's still the right thing to do.
All right, thank you. So what it actually does is it takes away his discretion to be able to sentence a person accordingly based on the facts that are before them. We believe that a person should be sentenced based on the facts that are before the judge, as well as his history. We are able to use his history and determine the sentence that you want, but he shouldn't be locked into a sentence to where not only this individual, but anybody that comes before him and afterwards receive that same sentence. And whenever you start removing that discretion, you're saying you're nothing but an individual that committed this crime, so therefore we place you in this box with others that have been committing that same crime all of their lives. And so we got to start looking at it from that perspective. So I'll just speak with a lawmaker and say, we believe that a person should be sentenced and held accountable for the crime that they committed, but we believe in an appropriate sentence for that individual that you're sentencing, and not just a sentence that has to be mandated by somebody telling the judge what he has to give an individual. Because oftentimes the punishment for the crime that this individual is committed is greater than the offense that they committed. And sorry for taking a long way around, Kevin.
Oh, no, that was perfect. That was perfect. Vanessa, as someone who's worked in the state capitals, I'm sure you have a different rapport or understanding with legislators. You probably know how to speak to them one-on-one and at their level, and know how to communicate with them. What would you say? Because a lot of times we meet legislators who, whether intentional or not, seem to be insensitive to an advocate or a loved one. And I don't want to say look down on them, but don't really take them seriously. So as someone who's had a career in this field, how would you speak to a lawmaker who has this great idea to introduce new mandatory minimum sentencing? And what would you say respectfully to stop them from doing that?
Well, from the advocacy perspective, to take myself out of this role and put myself into that role, like we've touched on, there's such a varying level of understanding of these issues. And I think, at the end of the day, everyone has the same goal, which is a safe community for themselves, their children, their families to live in. And how we get there looks different to different people. So finding out what that legislator's intended goal is really crucial. What's the problem that we're trying to solve? Is a mandatory minimum really going to be the thing that solves that? Or is there somewhere else along the way where we can prevent that from happening, where we can intervene in a different way to stop this cycle from happening? We are seeing more and more individuals with mental health and behavioral health problems end up in the justice system. And that's really difficult for law enforcement, who are financially strapped, resource strapped, staff strapped, to have to deal with. What can we prevent from happening on the front end if we invest differently in our law enforcement, if we create more holistic community approaches to the issues that we're dealing with? How many victims can we stop from becoming victims? How many people who have these mental health and behavioral health problems, can we link up with resources to get help so that they don't end up in the justice system? It's really about what that individual is trying to accomplish through that mandatory minimum, and understanding what the root problem is and a different way to solve that problem, a better way to solve that problem, a more financially responsible way to solve that problem. And I'm going to use this time just to quickly compare Florida to another state. There's an abundance of research, as we all know, on how longer lengths of stay in prison don't produce better outcomes. So as a fun fact, if you compare Florida and Nevada, two very different states in their sentencing, Florida's recidivism rate has been just under 50% for the better part of a decade. And Nevada's is under 25%, looking at 2019. So something's going on, and I'm not going to say that Florida's people are just worse than the people in Nevada. I think there's a different approach that Florida could take to solve this issue. Learn what an individual is trying to solve, and come prepared by partnering and learning from places like FAMM and like other organizations on what works to actually solve the problem that that individual is looking to tackle.
Thank you. Thank you. Sagan, as an impacted family member and as someone who advocates on behalf of other impacted families, what would you say directly to a lawmaker who is interested in introducing new mandatory minimums? Did we lose Sagan? While we get Sagan back on, Judge Sharp, I would love to hear your opinion on this as well before we close out.
Yeah, well, thank you. It's really a combination of everything we've heard here today. You've got to use the FAMM resources and understand the facts and figures and the data, right? Because I get so frustrated when I hear, wait a minute, there was this event happened over here, and everybody rushes to create new legislation to solve that problem that may or may not be a problem. It's just an event that happened, and everybody ignores the data. But on the flip side, people aren't moved by spreadsheets. They get moved by stories. And so to take the Sagan story and Matthew's story and Chris's story and whatever your individual stories are that are all real and make us humans, and take that and then merge it with the data to come out with, back to what Vanessa was talking about, what's the problem we're trying to solve? Here's what the data says about that. And let me tell you how that affects people. And if you can weave that story, that moves legislators, that moves people, and we understand the stories, right? If you can hear Sagan's story, that to me is so powerful to listen to that, or tell the story of what effect that has. Let me weave that with the data that Matthew and Vanessa are talking about, so that a legislator can feel like they have the ability to solve a problem and understand the problem they're trying to solve.
Thank you. Thank you. And Sagan, as an impacted family member who advocates for impacted families, what would you say to a lawmaker?
I think first I would say, please don't. But I would, kind of go back to the story and really talk about the impact and really advocate for things that we can do differently. Just because we've done something for the last 25, 30 plus years doesn't mean that we still need to do it today, and really just kind of hone in on the stories. I think the stories, when people hear not only my story, but other people that look like me stories, that it has an impact on those individuals, not even from my perspective, but as well as from Judge Sharp's perspective as well, hearing the impact of him being the one that's behind the decision based on the rules and regulations that he should follow. I think it's kind of twofold. You're hearing from two different people that was impacted differently based on the mandatory minimum. So I say all that to say that I would go back to the stories and the impact and really kind of push how we can do things differently.
Thank you. Thank you. We appreciate you all so much for joining us today for an excellent conversation. I know I learned a lot, and I'm sure our audience learned a lot too. For everyone who's watching, if you want to learn more about the work we do here at FAMM, please follow us online and visit our website, famm.org, and look forward to more policy briefings like this in the future. We want to make sure that we remain engaged and that we take your questions and we take your story seriously, and we provide you all with solutions. So with that, thank you all and have a great weekend.